this is the RPG Crawler, and welcome to another Tabletops and Taverns. We've taken a look at low fantasy and gaming, and now it's time to examine high fantasy. As before, I'm going to give a basic rundown of my understanding of the genre, some examples of some games and settings which are considered high fantasy, then break down some of the main elements of high fantasy settings and talk a bit about ways you can include them in your game. I'll go over some of the pros and cons of high fantasy settings afterwards. Remember, this series does not endorse high or low fantasy as supreme in every single situation. I've played enough games and read enough literature to know that they both have their place and are useful to focus on different kinds of stories. I hate to put this disclaimer up there, but it seems that we live in a day and age where you have to do that or people immediately get into the comments section. Once again, I will primarily cover medieval fantasy sources, simply because that's what I know best. However, the nature of high fantasy can easily transcend basic medieval settings, especially in those sorts of games that use magic as a sort of substitute for technology. It can be very easy for a high fantasy setting to be nominally medieval, but look very modern indeed. High fantasy, or epic fantasy, is largely defined by its scope, whether it be the scope of its plot, the events therein, the characters involved, or the very setting itself. High fantasy also tends to have worlds with different rules than ours. In a high fantasy setting, magic may still be a little understood force, but it generally has sweeping effects that may well impact the lives of the average day-to-day person. In some high fantasy settings, magic or alternative physics may be very well understood and used in almost a scientific manner. The world itself in a high fantasy setting is often very different from our own as a result. Where some of the same historical influences that affected our world may still be seen, it is not unusual to have things like multiple moons, hollow worlds, floating islands, and similar such fantastic locations peeking in as well. Several beloved fantasy series are very, very much high fantasy. The Lord of the Rings, for instance, is the archetypal setting. But there are many things, such as The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, the Xanth series, even the Discworld series, that still fall into that same sort of group. A common theme is that these are relatively complete worlds that follow their own internally consistent rules that often differ drastically from our own. In gaming terms, high fantasy games include a large number of popular console and computer games, such as the Final Fantasy series, the Dragon Quest series, arguably the Ultima series, and on tabletop things like Eberron, Forgotten Realms, etc. As before, we'll examine mostly how high fantasy comes across in the gaming world, but a lot of high fantasy literature series have been made into their own game settings by themselves, so there may be quite a bit of crossover. Something I noticed while trying to compile information for this video, and it might just be me, but it seems like high fantasy has a sort of lopsided distribution of games and systems, at least when compared to low fantasy. There's that same diverse list of qualities that make up a fair definition of high fantasy, just like there is for low fantasy. There's the same gradation of games over that criteria, and some that really, really stick to the whole high fantasy setting without a doubt, and some that may miss one or 2 points all the way down the line, but are still, generally speaking, high fantasy. Some games, as I said, are very, very high fantasy without a doubt, and it just seems to me that compared to low fantasy, there's a lot more games that are clearly, undeniably high fantasy than there are, on the other side, games that are undeniably low fantasy. And I believe this is due to the very nature of epic fantasy. It makes for very cinematic conflicts with clear-cut boundaries that a player can readily align with one way or another. It's not really fair to judge whether the storytelling in a high fantasy game is somehow easier, but it does open itself to a more lavish spectacle, which can be very attractive to a game designer or creator, especially in the world of video games, compared to, say, the grimmer and grittier tone of low fantasy. Just a idle observation there. So What are some common elements of high fantasy versus low fantasy? As always, it's not a hard and fast thing. There's no easy line to draw, and some series tend to blur the lines more than others. But generally speaking, there's a few things that qualify something as high fantasy. First is just how fantastic things are. I know that sounds stupid, but I mean in terms of how drastically different the setting is from our own world. I mentioned this before, but there's a bunch of settings with generally accepted magic, magic as science, and in some cases science as magic, that basically kind of form the core of high fantasy. The Final Fantasy series of games, for instance, invariably veers towards high fantasy even as at its tamest. You know, you got giant flying chickens and airships in the older episodes. I haven't played many of the new ones. Like crystals that channel elemental powers. You got the elemental summons. Even in an ordinarily sci-fi world in some of those Final Fantasy games, you've still got like the existence of magic. And all of that contributes to the feeling that magic is everywhere to be seen. The common people may fear it, but not necessarily as much as the low fantasy trope of magic being some sort of witchcraft or an extension of some evil force. In the same way, a modern person might fear a modern weapon, generally speaking, or even a large and noisy machine, but for the most part, and I'm not going to get into this, they generally understand that they're just machines, they're just tools. Likewise, in a high fantasy setting, magic is more of a tool, not necessarily its own malevolent force. It can be a force that can be used to improve lives if it's set in the right hands, for instance. And that's a real defining factor compared to, say, the low fantasy, where all magic may be some sort of chaotic pact with demons or whatever. This, in and of itself, can sometimes result in more fanciful tones and themes creeping into the game. In the early editions of the Dungeons & Dragons game, as much as the various designers involved might have tried to mimic a sort of medieval world, there are still some things that crept in, either as an attempt to intentionally be silly, or simply to reinforce the strangeness of a particular setting. One doesn't have to look much further than some of the official, albeit comical, supplements that managed to make it into print. Certain things like the Book of Marvelous Magic tended to list magical items with more serious tones, but you also had things like the Book of Wondrous Inventions, which had magic items like the animated money changing machine, which is basically an ATM run by a magic gnome, or Ardraken's refreshment simulacrum, which was a soft drink vending machine. Admittedly, those are largely there for laughs, but let's take a look at some of the modules at the time. EX1 and EX2, Dungeonland and the Land Beyond the Magic Mirror, were basically Alice in Wonderland in D&D. Extreme examples, I know, but in the early days of the game, this sort of content meant that even though a lot of people feel today the early D&D was a more gritty, low fantasy tone, it was definitely high fantasy in its core there. It certainly meets the bar by the current definitions. And later editions, they didn't make that situation much better, as the magical content of the base system and the assumed parameters of the default worlds involved became more standardized over the passing editions. As item and spell creation rules became more formulaic, we run into this whole concept, and it generally started in 3rd edition and accelerated into 4th edition and then Pathfinder, where characters were sort of expected to own a certain amount of reliable, available magic items, just like tools in a box, or have access to a set number of magical capabilities through spellcasting or whatever. Encounters and entire adventures were scaled based on that basic assumption. This even crossed over to the artwork, a critical part of setting up a game's tone in the minds of those who see it for the first time, and it changed to reflect this. The artwork evolved from showing ragtag bands of vaguely medieval groups of adventurers, like you'd see in like AD&D 2nd edition art, to something that's been turned dungeon punk, where modern looks and styles mingle with the obvious magical effects, whether they be rays and spells projected from wizards to glowing weapons and shining glyphs on armor everywhere you look, like you're in some sort of video game. In fact, this might arise from fantasy video games like MMOs, say World of Warcraft, EverQuest, etc., where flashy particle effects around high-end weapons are pretty much the norm. In a world where you can go down to ye old magic shop and pick up a fiery sword +2 and a shield +3 right off the shelf, it actually kind of makes sense that that kind of look would creep in. Another thing to mention, just between this, is that the availability of magic and the fantastic situations that you'd see in the earlier editions of the game, even the fact that there are dungeons themselves, which may not make a lot of sense, tends to veer off from the low fantasy to the what the fuck kind of realm of high fantasy wonder and high magic. That mystic underworld that you go into on some adventures. Anyway, back to the availability of magic. Not every high fantasy game necessarily has that ready availability of magic. Even in series and worlds where the presence of magic is slightly more limited, its ready acceptance has certain consequences beyond what you might expect. I mean, beyond just being able to pull out a tool for every moment, for every situation. In many instances, magic and magical effects may have the same sort of impact that modern technology does. Cities may be cleaner as a result, or if not strictly cleaner, the more robust infrastructure behind them may allow them to grow larger than many medieval cities did, and with fewer ill effects overall. Magical means of communication in some settings may allow for far-flung empires to maintain cohesion a bit better than they would in a strictly medieval or low fantasy setting, and allow troop movements and strategies in times of war to be more reflective of what you'd see on a modern battlefield, where the information is readily available and communications are pretty standard. Further, there's almost a democratization of power as a result, or at least this idea that the side of good often recognizes the worth of the common folk, at least to a greater degree than you'd see in actual real-world history. Alright, it's true that every setting is different, even amongst high fantasy worlds, and you're probably not going to be looking at a full-blown Western-style democracy in many situations in these worlds, but there is that modern sensibility in quite a few of them. Kings and monarchs tend to be respectful of the people's wishes, at least in terms of presenting a relatively free society, and even absolute monarchs tend to be represented as benevolent unless they are on the side of evil. On that flip side, the enemy, on the evil side, tends to be very, very evil, very, very corrupt, with either a focus on conquest, enslaving the world, and so forth, or a focus on maintaining power at all costs. And they are very much set on the extremes. And that kind of brings us to the next major quality often present in high fantasy games, or high fantasy literature at all. That is, good versus evil. There's this eternal struggle between a side of light and a side of darkness. Of course, that's not present in every high fantasy game, and of late, more do try to present shades of gray or factions with different motivations behind them, but a large number of the games and the literature that preceded them, especially older games and settings, just take the easy route and make this grand, sweeping force of evil the norm. Even if they may obscure the true evil at first, it's just so common that the entire conflict devolves into this obvious evil versus the obvious good, that it's just become part and parcel of what high fantasy is a lot of times. As I mentioned above, this does lend itself to grand cinematic conflicts, but a lot of this tendency also arises from the fact that in such a high magic, fantastic world, villains and heroes alike can count on all manner of supernatural effects, whether it be extensive use of magic, the alliance of supernatural forces, etc., etc. In the Heroes of Might and Magic series, for instance, entire factions are defined purely by their possessions of angel or infernal powers. In the Dark Sun setting, you've got grand sorcerer kings that sacrifice the population of entire cities just to feed their magical transmutations so they can become these immortal, all-powerful dragons. With such power at the villain's command, the Darkest of Hearts can wreak havoc on this grand scale that's just so much different than the real personal things that you'd see in a low fantasy game. In games versus literature especially, this is further exacerbated by the scale of the threat that evil puts into motion. In my low fantasy gaming video, I mentioned that low fantasy, as I just said, tends to focus on smaller scale conflicts between individuals or threats that work on a personal level. The individual heroes might be the focus of the villain's schemes, or they may encompass a local village or city, but in high fantasy, the entire world may be at play, or in some instances, multiple worlds. The stereotypical save the world kind of storyline that so many games rely on over time is almost the default plot for so many high fantasy games and stories. And it's not necessarily a bad thing, as familiarity can lead to the genre being well defined, but it can make certain things very predictable. Fortunately, more modern interpretations of high fantasy in games have started to drift away from that classic setup, if not completely, then at least enough to vary some of the expectations. I personally believe this is not only because of a wish to diversify the themes of high fantasy beyond the basic good and evil tropes and kind of develop the art, but also just as a natural aside from the rise of multiplayer and sandbox-style games. In an RPG like EverQuest or World of Warcraft, or one of the many other MMO derivatives, there's rarely just one overwhelming force of good or evil. I mean, yes, there's some present, but aside from the main force, there's usually a lot of factions. As goofy as it may sound to use these as an example, they do highlight that whole multiple factions with their own motivations, good and bad elements kind of thing creeping along, that high fantasy has traditionally avoided, but now is kind of embracing. In a sandbox-style game, by contrast, whether it be something like Skyrim or just a pen-and-paper hex crawl kind of exploration, they may be set in a high fantasy-style world, and there may even be multiple organizations or cultures to encounter and possibly join. Interestingly, although I just used these games as examples of how modern high fantasy has started towards this whole, or away from this whole monolithic good versus evil thing, all of the examples I just mentioned, Skyrim, World of Warcraft, whatever, they do have their own world-threatening evil to contend with, even though they've also got the whole faction struggle. Whether it be the Burning Legion of Warcraft or the Alduin from Skyrim, echoes of that whole eternal conflict of good versus evil are still present, even in the more nuanced of games. One consequence of this focus on good versus evil in high fantasy, aside from the aforementioned formulaic feel of the storylines, is that most games in a high fantasy setting tend to assume that the player or the players are portraying the hero. Not just the protagonist, but rather someone actively working for the cause of good. Even those games where the player has taken on the role of some sort of anti-hero, they're generally, not always, but generally presumed to do the right thing at the end of the day. Compare this to low fantasy, where it's more often assumed that the player characters are motivated primarily by self-interest. Whether by the allure of money or glory or simple survival, a low fantasy hero is less fully aligned with the cause of good for good's sake. Of course, stepping away from computer games into role-playing games, non-good characters in high fantasy tabletop are generally more common, but by no means are they the rule. Most published modules, with a few prime exceptions, but most published modules operate off of this assumption that the players, as a group, tend towards the side of good, and much of their storylines tend to break down to one degree or another if this is not the case. And in fact, a few of those exceptions take the opposite route and assume that they're on the side of evil, as I said before, the extreme evil side, so it's really just the same thing in a mirror. The final general quality of high fantasy gaming that I'm going to touch on in this video is the length of the stories involved. In literature, this is reflected by the number of the books in the series, with the big epic sagas of high fantasy literature contrasting with the classic sword and sorcery short stories or collections of short stories. In a computer game, this could be seen as the number of sequels in a successful series, and on tabletop games, the number of source books a setting generates or how fleshed out a particular history of the area is. Now, this doesn't translate directly. After all, in literature, a series basically starts long enough to tell a particular storyline and might increase from there, whereas with games, the commercial success of the original game will generally determine whether sequels and spin-offs and additional source books are worthwhile. However, what sequels, if they're set in the same world, and source books also in the same world do, that they have in common with the long literary saga, is that they greatly expand the world and the lore around it. This won't apply to some console RPGs like Final Fantasy that make a different world each time, but for some of them, like the Elder Scrolls series or the Ultima series, each later game added onto the lore in the background and further fleshed the world out. The first 3 Dragon Quest games, for instance, told a linked tale that followed a particular line of heroes through this epic history, where they faced this great evil on 3 occasions, and each subsequent game, at least in that first trilogy, built upon the world in question. On tabletop games, Forgotten Realms has been around through every iteration of the D&D game since AD&D First Edition, and if you read each of the campaign source books in turn for each of those editions, you really get a sense for a world that's been developed over time, sometimes by many, many people, and has become epic in scope. And that's to say nothing of the numerous source books, box sets, adventures, and actual novel series associated with that particular setting. Indeed, at least in this instance of the novels, it's almost a saga of different sagas, a whole series of different heroic tales written by different people, all linked in that one common setting. And that really does fit into the whole scope of high fantasy. On a more general level, stepping away from settings, the very concept of a campaign in D&D and related games, not a setting itself, as I said, but the campaign, the linked series of adventures that span a character's career, might be seen to be derived from that whole epic saga tradition of high fantasy. I mentioned in my low fantasy video that the Dungeons & Dragons game has historically been most well balanced at low levels, say level 1 to 5, with the power scale increasing the higher you get. It transitions from a relatively brutal and grim feel where a bad ambush or a botched initiative roll might end your run in one round, to a world-spanning high magic realm where the dead can even be raised if a particular mishap occurs. At that power level, travel from one continent to another isn't unheard of, and the PCs can affect the fate of entire planes of existence. And it's all done through this campaign system where the characters' careers are explored from humble beginnings through adventure after adventure, building up on one another. Where a low fantasy game may focus on one relatively standalone adventure, maybe a couple tied in together with very little except for the main characters, a typical D&D campaign in the modern sense will have this overarching storyline, one which builds upon itself in a style, and it's very much like the Lord of the Rings. It'll generally link very smaller challenges together towards facing some great nemesis. Pathfinder adventure paths, a lot of them are built on the same principle. Another purely game-related consequence of this long-term saga/campaign style of play, especially prevalent in a fantasy gaming, is that of power creep. It's an unfortunate side effect of the ready existence of magic over long-term play. After all, to the victor go the spoils. Every time a player overcomes a challenge, they may get the resources that the foe that they just faced didn't expend. In a low fantasy game, that may consist of a few jewelry pieces, some coin, maybe some sturdy weapons to replace any that may have been lost or broken. In a high fantasy game, however, this generally will consist of at least a magic weapon, some armor, any consumables that whoever they just faced may not have been able to use, potions, scrolls, and so forth. Over time, these things add up. If the game has a working magic economy, these items can be sold and the money then used for more useful things. The same thing happens in an extended low fantasy game, but generally speaking, there's more expenditures in a low fantasy game than a high fantasy game. The amount of treasure accumulated in a low fantasy game also tends to be lower. In a longer-term high fantasy game, as the characters accumulate personal power, either through the acquisition of treasure and personal abilities, the foes that they face must increase in power as well to provide any sort of challenge. Further, to borrow an earlier concept, the whole good versus evil trope, the idea that most high fantasy characters' foes are truly evil increases the chance that the party will want to actually actively defeat them rather than evade or avoid them. A low fantasy group may go ahead and take the easier road out and go around an enemy, whereas a high fantasy campaign motivated by good versus evil, they may veer towards it and actively, look to crush it. A defeated foe yields more treasure in the form of gear and personal belongings than one that is simply evaded or tricked somehow. So in the end, the result is this continuous upward powered slide, and that's all well and good if that's the goal. But if you're looking to control it, it can sometimes take a deft hand to manage it at higher levels. So we have some of the major aspects of high fantasy and how they may be seen in gaming. There's undoubtedly quite a few more that I've missed, but we're going to call it at that. So where does that leave us? Should we want to apply those things to a high fantasy game? Actually, the aspects discussed leave us in a very, very good place. A lot of tropes of high fantasy are pretty standard, almost cliche, and that's not always a bad thing. If you're designing some great story arc to take place over a 20-level D&D campaign, for instance, the whole save the world from an evil empire kind of theme present in a lot of high fantasy games is not going to go that far wrong for you. If your players are up for a sort of fantastic, high magic, epic sort of play, then throwing them against the minions of some big bad evil, whether it be a dragon, an evil wizard, a vampire lord, whatever, wouldn't be that out of place. You can be as subtle or as blatant as you wish, you can add whatever twists and turns you can think of, but if you decide to go the high fantasy route, there's no shame in borrowing the most commonly used themes, so to speak. It's like it writes itself. Likewise, a high fantasy game offers a high degree of flexibility in terms of the setting itself, and its various qualities. With a low fantasy game, you might feel constrained by the very real need to keep things at least moderately logical and to adapt challenges in story to a world where magical healing may not be immediately available, nor magical weapons and things that help characters survive. In a high fantasy game, some of this is alleviated. If you want airships, it's no trouble to put them in. If you want to include a worldwide organization, a magical academy that teaches magic as if it were a science, or any other such things on a whim, then they can be thrown in without overly impacting the feel of a high magic setting. The only real element that might be problematic is the tendency towards power creep. Keeping things advancing in a reasonable manner can be a difficult balance, as I suggested above, as your players accrue more power over time, but it's really only a problem if you want it to be. There's been plenty of console games where, say, the players end up fighting a planet-sized villain set on devouring the universe, or manifestations of the primal force of chaos itself. On the tabletop end, there's been many an adventure where the players end up facing demon princes, archdevils, or sometimes some of the gods themselves. People say this may cheapen the experience of play or tend towards munchkinism or whatever, but if your group just wants to go all out, go epic, then there's nothing wrong with that as long as everyone's on board for that kind of play. The grand scale of high fantasy very much also lends itself towards a military-style game. The classic good versus evil of high fantasy is often expressed in terms of grand armies clashing, and this in and of itself opens the doors to the players being part of said armies, either as leaders, champions, or doing special forces type missions against the backdrop of the siege or invasions themselves. The journey into hostile territory motif is something worth looking at as well if you happen to take inspiration from, say, Frodo's quest to Mount Doom. Players in a high fantasy game can generally be counted on to be able to pull together more resources than those in a low fantasy game. Part of this is a consequence of the same elements that contribute to power creep, but from a DM's perspective, it can be assumed that at any given level, once the characters have some experience under their belt, they can pretty much overcome any reasonable, or sometimes even unreasonable, threats that you throw at them. In a game with accessible magic, even low-end threats like the darkness, being lost in the wilderness, or basic survival in inclement weather, where they would be threats, serious threats sometimes in low fantasy games, in a high fantasy game, they can generally be overcome with relative ease, either through low-level spells or even something like a cantrip or an Orazon, or accessible magic items. As the game progresses, even death itself may fall by the wayside as a threat. In essence, you don't really have to pull your punches when designing challenges, at least not as much as you'd think. Now, I've said familiar things about low fantasy in the past, not pulling your punches, designing for challenge, but I did so for different reasons. In low fantasy, a high challenge can bring a grittier feel to things and encourage more creative thinking. In a high fantasy game, your characters probably have the resources to overcome almost anything you throw at them, and it may make them feel heroic to be able to actually use some of those abilities and items for once, rather than just having them moldering away in their bag somewhere. From a playstyle standpoint, high fantasy supports quite a few different approaches, but it excels at a few things. The rule of cool characters who are designed about flashy combos and weapon styles and abilities may be more at home in a high fantasy game. Also, the crusading type of character fits in better here than in low fantasy. The type of player who would like to play the dashing paladin carving their way through an army of demons is probably better served in a high fantasy setting that can more appropriately provide not only the abyssal foes, but also the support structure to let that character, survive. Those players who enjoy intrigue and coalition building type diplomacy on a national level will also probably enjoy a high fantasy setting if it's done right. While these are present in low fantasy settings as well to a certain extent, the sheer scope of epic fantasy can be a real boon in providing them the opportunities that they'd want to engage in such play. So yes, both high and low fantasy have their places. They both have their strengths and their weaknesses. If your group is looking to engage in a more personal, more limited, and episodic content with a grittier feel, then low fantasy is probably better suited for them. However, if you're looking for a long-term, broad arc with fewer shades of gray and chances for the characters to really let loose, face sweeping challenges and conflicts, and go for flashy cinematic, events, then you may want to take a look at high fantasy if you haven't already. I've personally played both and recognize the merits of each in their own time. I know these episodes haven't really been truly in-depth, but I hope they've provided at least a groundwork for those who've wondered at the difference between low and high fantasy, perhaps a bit of entertainment value for those who are already quite comfortable with the concepts involved. I'm going to wrap things up here on that note. For now, this has been the RPG Crawler with high fantasy and role-playing. If you like what you've seen, remember to leave a like, comment if you've got feedback, and subscribe for more RPG content. Until next time, take care and goodbye.